In this video, with a quick example and really practical example, I want to show you why we need async and await functionalities in a server component in Next.js. But before that, let me show how a client component works in Next.js or basically React.js. Next.js is based on React.js to some extent, actually. If I go to block client route here we have a really simple component, but this is really common when we want to write an application with React.js or Next.js. Basically, we have an API here and we want to fetch data, and then we want to show that data. This is the core idea here. So in a client component, the very first thing you see is this use client syntax here. Basically, with this syntax, we say to Next.js that we want this component to be a client component. Now, when we say use client, it means that we can use all the functionalities in React.js components, like all hooks, like use effect or use state. So now here, when we want to fetch an API like this, usually we just create a function. For instance, here I create a function called getPosts, and this method here is an async function. I already explained the idea behind async and await when we are fetching an API in JavaScript in another video. So please watch that video if you don't know how async and await work in the first place. I try to explain it here as well a little bit. So here basically, let me comment this. We will get back to this one. But here we just want to use fetch method to fetch data from this API. And here, because a fetch returns a promise object, we need to use await to keep the program waiting for the response here actually. If I remove await from this line here, it just returns a promise, but the data is not prepared in the promise object. Then in the next line, when we get the data after this line, when the program goes to the second line, again, the same thing happens here. Rest.json returns basically a promise object, but the data is not still in promise object because it takes a little bit of time for the data to be ready and return. So here we again use await keyword. So program stops at this line until the data is ready. Then when the data is ready, we have it here, and then we can update our state. Use set posts. So to keep the post data here, we define state using use state hook, and we have post and set post method to update post state here. Also here I used a fake fetch function to actually mimic a behavior of a long request. In this case, when I want to fetch this API, it's really fast, so we don't notice it. So I just created a fake fetch function, and we can see it here in utils.js. It's basically based on set timeout, and it's just a delay. That's all it does. And then it waits for 2 or 3 seconds and then continues the program line by line. So in a component like this, what we have, let me show it to you. If I go to block client route, the very first thing we see is the list of posts here. In the client component, this is what happens. When it's trying to render the component for the very first time, renders this line and then comes to this line. Here there is nothing in post state, so it doesn't show anything. But with use effect, we say that execute this method for the very first time when you are mounting the component. So then it calls get posts in the beginning of rendering the component, comes here, executes these lines one by one, then updates post state here. And now because React.js, or basically client component, works based on states and re-render itself when a state gets changed, it re-renders this part again based on the new data we have in this post state. So the re-rendering happens because of state gets changed. But what I want to focus here is about a server component. So if we want to do the same thing exactly in a server component, the component would be like this, but with a difference here. Here we don't have access to hooks in server components in Next.js. So what should we do if the request takes too long? For instance, here I again use the same fake fetch method to mimic the behavior of a long request. So in this case that we don't have use effect or use state hooks, what should we do? Here, async and await functionality come into play. Let me first show the result to you. So here, if I use block server, we see pretty much the same thing. If I try to use it in a new tab, So it's gonna wait for the whole page to load. And that's the difference between these two components, client components and server components. Because in the server component, the whole page waits for the component to be completed all together, and then it gets all the data from the backend and shows it to us. But here, to make the component wait for the whole response, we use async and await here. So what happens if I remove these two keywords? The very first problem is that it says that there is no posts that you can use map method on that. So for now, I just comment this part here. And now when I refresh it, the only thing you see here is the list of posts, and you see it immediately when I reload the page. You don't have to wait for the whole response. And the reason is that I removed async and await keywords here. So the program doesn't wait for these lines to be completed anymore. How posts look like here. So if I try to print posts here, when we use console log in the server component, you need to see the result, you need to see the output in the terminal. There is nothing in the dev dashboard here. So here, if you take a look at the result, you can see that what we get is basically a promise object. It's not a data, but rather it's a promise object, which is not completed yet. So this is what happens here. When the program goes to this line, it calls get posts in this line, but it doesn't stop at this line. Immediately it gets the response, which is a promise, because we used async here and it returns a promise. Now in a separate process, it's running all these lines step by step because we're using await keyword here. So it comes here, my fake fetch waits for this to be completed, and then wait for this fetch again to be completed, then goes to the next line, wait for rest.json to be completed, and then indeed it returns the data. But the problem is that the program wasn't waiting for this line to be completed, and it's already past this line here. And what we have now in post is just the promise. So at the moment it was trying to render the whole component, posts was just promise. There was no data there. But as soon as it returns the data to posts, it has already rendered the component, and we don't have any functionality like use effect to make it to re-render it itself based on the updated data, because that's how a server component works. A server component waits for the whole response and then pass it to the front end, and then front end shows it to us. So when I add await here and then async keyword here, this is what happens. So it comes to this line, it calls getPosts method, but it waits for getPosts to be completed before going to the next line. While if I remove await and see keywords from here, it calls getPosts, and because immediately it returns promise to posts, it goes to the next line immediately. But here when we use async and await keywords before going to the next line, waits for the whole response to be completed, basically for the promise to be completed. And this is what happens here and why we need async and await. And some people think that here we have used some components like suspense, which I have already explained why we need suspense in another video. Please watch that video as well. But we use suspense when we are dealing with an async server component. If we are supposed to remove async and await from here, we need to create another server component that implements async functionality in itself and then includes these lines here. So basically, we need to do the same thing as we were doing here. There is no difference with that. The whole point here is that if we have some methods and functions that return a promise object instead of the actual data, we need to use async and await. In all of these cases, all of these methods, my fake fetch, rest.json, all of these return a promise object. When you are dealing with a promise object, you have to use async and await to make the code wait for the whole response. Otherwise, you need to be a client component. So that way here, for instance, you get the chance to re-render the parts you need based on the updated data. That was the whole point for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more of these videos. Thank you so much. Bye bye.